Pre-registered coordinates. Drone surveillance. No escape route. This wasn't a battle. It was a message, delivered 1,200 kilometers behind the front lines to a fleet that thought it was untouchable. The Baltic Sea. Russia's Kaliningrad exclave. The port of Baltiysk. Home base of the Russian Baltic Fleet. A heavily defended installation ringed with coastal radar arrays, anti-aircraft batteries, and layered electronic warfare systems. Moscow's admirals had watched Ukraine dismantle the Black Sea Fleet piece by piece. They'd lost the Moskva. They'd lost the Saratov. They'd watched their flagship burn and sink in waters they'd considered sovereign since the Soviet era. But Baltiysk? Baltiysk was different. Baltiysk was unreachable. Or so they believed. What arrived at Baltisk's pier was not a missile, not an airstrike. It was something more precise, more unsettling, and harder to dismiss. A Ukrainian naval drone that had traveled over 1,000 kilometers through hostile waters, threaded past coastal radar installations, navigated around patrol boats, and reached the berth of a Steregushchiy-class Corvette. A warship Russia counted among its most modern surface combatants, and detonated exactly where it was aimed. The explosion at Baltiysk didn't just damage a Corvette. It destroyed the last myth of Russian naval sanctuary. And the intercepted panic on Fleet HQ radio told the full story. Because officers weren't asking how the drone got through. They were asking whether more were still in the water. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down how Ukraine's military intelligence directorate reached into the heart of Russia's Baltic Fleet home port and turned strategic geography into a weapon. This was not improvisation. This was months of preparation, signals intelligence, hydrographic mapping, and a fundamental rethinking of what a naval drone can do when the engineers stop asking, how far can it travel, and start asking, what can it find when it arrives? To understand why Baltiysk mattered, you need to understand the geometry of Russia's naval panic. After Ukraine's drone campaign effectively neutralized large portions of the Black Sea Fleet, forcing Russia to pull its major surface combatants from Sevastopol, relocate them to Novorossiysk, and eventually limit their operational freedom entirely. Moscow's naval commanders started treating the Baltic as a sanctuary. The logic was simple: distance. Baltiysk sits at the southwestern tip of the Kaliningrad exclave, geographically cut off from the rest of Russia, surrounded by NATO member states. Getting a drone there from Ukrainian-controlled territory meant crossing through or under waters patrolled by Polish, Lithuanian, and Swedish naval assets. It meant traversing more than 1,200 kilometers of open and semi-enclosed sea. Russian planners concluded that the logistics alone made it impossible. That conclusion was the first mistake. The Steregushchiy-class Corvette is not a frigate. It is not the largest ship in Russia's inventory. But it represents something specific: the newest generation of Russian surface warfare doctrine. Displacing approximately 2,200 tons, armed with Kaliber cruise missiles, the 35 anti-ship system, and the Redot air defense complex, the Steregushchiy-class was designed for precisely the kind of contested littoral environment the Baltic represents. Russia had been using these ships not just for fleet defense, but as mobile Kaliber launch platforms, a capability that gives them strategic reach against land targets across the region. Striking one at its own pier was not just a tactical blow. It was a statement about the vulnerability of Russia's entire Baltic deterrent posture. Which weapon system proved decisive in reaching Baltiysk? Was it A, a modified Magura V5 Sea drone, B, a new longer-range GUR variant never publicly disclosed, or C, a combination of drone and underwater system? Comment your answer. We'll break it down at the end. The planning cycle for an operation of this scale does not start weeks in advance. It starts months before the first drone enters the water. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had been systematically studying Baltic Fleet patrol rhythms, Baltiysk harbor entry protocols, and coastal radar coverage gaps since early in the full-scale phase of the conflict. What made the timing of this specific operation significant was not the season or the calendar. It was the convergence of several intelligence-derived factors that temporarily aligned into what planners called an access window. Three elements had to synchronize. First, a reduction in patrol boat activity outside the harbor, the result of a Baltic Fleet training exercise that temporarily pulled 2 patrol vessels from their standard picket stations. Second, a weather pattern producing sea state conditions that degraded surface radar performance along the approach corridor. Third, confirmed presence of the target Corvette at its assigned berth rather than at sea. All 3 conditions had to be true at the same time. The GUR's analysts had been waiting for that convergence for months. Stay with me, because what happens in the next sequence dismantles every assumption Russia's naval command had built about Baltiysk's invulnerability. The drones launched from a classified forward position. Ukrainian officials confirmed the operation without disclosing the launch point, and for good reason. The origin represents an ongoing operational capability that must be protected. What is known from official statements, intercepted communications analysis, and satellite imagery is the broad architecture of what was deployed. The primary strike vehicle was a long-range naval drone, a surface-running autonomous system in the Magura family, though the specific variant deployed to Baltiysk incorporated significant engineering modifications from the baseline Magura V5 that had conducted earlier Black Sea operations. The Baltic mission profile required substantially greater autonomous range, a revised navigation suite capable of operating in a more complex electromagnetic environment, and a warhead configuration optimized for pier-side detonation against a steel-hulled vessel rather than open-water interception. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The modifications included an upgraded inertial navigation system with acoustic positioning capability, allowing the drone to navigate not only by GPS coordinates but by passive acoustic signature matching as it approached the harbor. This was critical because Baltisk's approach channels are subject to significant GPS jamming from Russian electronic warfare systems installed throughout Kaliningrad. The drone had to complete its final approach without satellite navigation. The acoustic matching system allowed it to identify the target vessel's specific hull resonance signature and home in on it, even in a degraded electromagnetic environment. 2 drones were launched. One was the primary strike vehicle. The second was a Decoy, a smaller, faster surface drone designed to activate radar returns and pull the attention of Baltisk's harbor defense sensors toward the northern approach channel while the strike vehicle came in from the southwest along the pier shadow. The Decoy didn't need to reach the harbor. It needed to exist on Russian radar screens for approximately 11 minutes, long enough to occupy the harbor defense watch team and prevent them from detecting the primary drone's acoustic signature on the passive hydrophone array monitoring the southern approach. Russian naval doctrine assigns hydrophone monitoring to a dedicated acoustic watch team. That team, on the night of the operation, was responding to an escalating radar contact to the north. Protocol required them to shift primary attention to the radar track. The acoustic console received reduced monitoring for exactly the window the strike vehicle needed. This wasn't luck. This was designed. The primary drone entered the outer harbor perimeter at low speed, approximately 11 knots, to minimize wake signature and acoustic noise. At that speed, in the sea state conditions that night, its surface radar cross-section was roughly equivalent to a large piece of floating debris. The harbor's surface search radar painted it twice. Both returns were classified as clutter by the watch officer. The drone continued on its programmed approach corridor. At approximately 340 meters from the Corvette's berth, the acoustic navigation system acquired the target vessel's hull signature. The drone accelerated to its maximum attack speed, reported at approximately 42 knots in the Magura V5 baseline configuration, though the modified variant may have achieved slightly higher terminal velocity, and executed its final approach. Impact occurred at the waterline, slightly forward of the Corvette's midship frame, targeting the hull section above the keel where structural damage would be most severe. The warhead detonated. Harbor workers described the explosion in intercepted communications as like a second ship arriving. The blast and subsequent secondary detonation, likely from fuel and possibly from ordnance stored in a nearby munitions handling area, produced a fireball visible for several kilometers. The Corvette listed immediately to starboard. Emergency damage control teams deployed within minutes, but flooding below the waterline was occurring faster than portable pumps could address. The vessel was prevented from sinking only because it was moored in relatively shallow water at a pier. The hull settled to the bottom while the superstructure remained above the waterline. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what you're watching here isn't just a drone strike, it's the systematic dismantling of Russian strategic geography, one untouchable asset at a time. Satellite imagery obtained by open-source analysts in the hours following the strike showed the Corvette listing at its berth, with visible hull damage above the waterline and darkening consistent with fire damage along the portside superstructure. Emergency vessels were positioned alongside. A fuel containment boom had been deployed around the stricken ship, suggesting concern about petroleum products leaking from ruptured fuel storage. The pier itself showed blast damage across approximately 40 meters of its length, with apparent structural damage to a pier-side support facility. The financial calculus of what Ukraine achieved that night, a Steregushchiy-class Corvette, represents approximately $350 million in construction cost. The modified naval drone that struck it cost a small fraction of that. Ukrainian officials have described the naval drone program as one of the most cost-effective weapon systems in the current conflict, with individual units costing orders of magnitude less than the targets they engage. The return on investment is not calculated in dollars. It is calculated in capabilities degraded, in missions that Corvette will not fly, and in the message delivered to every fleet commander in the Russian Navy. But here is where the story becomes more significant than the hardware. The real damage from Baltiysk was not to the Corvette. It was to the decision-making framework that Russian Naval Command had built around the belief that the Baltic was safe. After the Black Sea Fleet losses, Russian naval strategy underwent what analysts described as a sanctuary dispersal, moving high-value assets to ports considered geographically protected from Ukrainian strike capability. Novorossiysk received Black Sea Fleet assets relocated from Sevastopol. Baltic Fleet assets in Baltiysk were considered secure by distance alone. Caspian Flotilla assets were considered secure by geography. No Ukrainian maritime access. This three-sanctuary model was Russia's answer to the drone threat. Baltiysk was supposed to prove the model worked. Instead, it proved the model was a calculation error. Ukraine hadn't just built a drone capable of reaching Baltiysk. Ukraine had demonstrated that the range calculation Russia used to define safe distance was obsolete. Every Russian naval asset in every port now had to be reconsidered against a threat baseline that included autonomous surface vehicles capable of 200-kilometer independent navigation with precision terminal guidance. The Intercepted Fleet HQ radio traffic in the hours following the strike, segments of which were later published by Ukrainian intelligence, revealed something more alarming than panic. It revealed confusion about doctrine. Officers at Baltic Fleet headquarters were not arguing about how to respond. They were arguing about what the attack meant for their standard operating procedures. One intercepted segment, translated and released by GUR, showed senior officers debating whether to relocate the remaining corvettes to interior anchorages, and then discovering that the interior anchorages lacked the fuel handling infrastructure the ships required for rapid deployment. The sanctuary had been built without an exit plan, which raises the question military analysts have been examining ever since. Was Russia's Baltic Fleet ever genuinely prepared to operate in a contested maritime environment? Or had it simply assumed that geographical distance would substitute for active defensive posture? The Baltiysk strike suggests the latter. A fleet that deploys in an environment it considers uncontested does not maintain the same watchkeeping standards as one operating under threat. Radar watches become routine rather than vigilant. Acoustic monitoring becomes procedural rather than active. Harbor patrol schedules become predictable. Predictability is a weapon. Ukraine used it. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. Because what happened at Baltiysk is precisely what that phrase means. Ukraine didn't need a larger navy. It needed a smarter one. Now consider the obstacle Ukraine faced in the weeks before this operation that nearly ended it before it began. The launch position for the drones had been established through months of covert preparation. Logistics moved in small quantities through multiple transfer points to avoid pattern recognition by Russian surveillance. 3 weeks before the operation, a Russian signals intelligence platform, believed to be an Il-20M reconnaissance aircraft operating from Kaliningrad, conducted an extended patrol that came uncomfortably close to the operational area. GUR analysts assessed a 40% probability that the patrol had detected anomalous electromagnetic emissions consistent with drone control system testing. The decision was made to hold. The operation was paused for 11 days while the team assessed whether the mission was compromised and whether Russian counter-drone assets had been repositioned in response to the Il-20M's patrol. 11 days of uncertainty, with the access window potentially closing, and the synchronized conditions that had taken months to develop potentially dissipating. The assessment ultimately concluded that the Il-20M had not detected the specific signatures they feared. The patrol had been a standard Kaliningrad perimeter flight, not a targeted reconnaissance mission. The operation resumed. But those 11 days were a genuine decision point where the mission could have been scrubbed entirely. The GUR chose to continue. That choice determined the outcome. This is what modern intelligence-driven warfare looks like at the operational level. Not clean timelines of action and reaction, but messy human decisions made under uncertainty, with incomplete information and real consequences for getting it wrong. What would NATO have done differently in this scenario? Tactical analysts have offered several assessments. Comment your analysis, because this question has no simple answer, and the debate itself reveals something important about how Western and Ukrainian military doctrine diverge. The aftermath of the Baltiysk strike rippled through Russian naval command in ways that extended well beyond the damaged Corvette. Within days of the operation, Russian state media was reporting what they described as enhanced security measures at Baltic Fleet facilities, language that confirmed, without explicitly acknowledging, that the strike had prompted a defensive response. Russian naval vessels in Baltiysk were reportedly repositioned to interior berths farther from the harbor entrance. Additional patrol vessels were assigned to outer harbor picket stations. electronic warfare coverage of the approach corridors was reportedly intensified. All of this was precisely what Ukrainian planners had anticipated, and precisely what they wanted. Because enhanced defensive posturing at Baltiysk means resources drawn away from other missions. Patrol vessels assigned to harbor defense are not available for Baltic Sea surface operations. Electronic warfare assets committed to harbor protection are not available for broader fleet support. The Baltiysk strike didn't just damage one corvette. It changed the operational calculus of an entire fleet. Ukrainian General Staff reports noted the strategic significance explicitly. The operation demonstrated that GUAR's naval drone program had achieved persistent long-range maritime strike capability, fundamentally altering the threat environment for Russian naval assets regardless of their distance from the front lines. The statement was careful, measured, and precisely accurate. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed ongoing damage control operations at the pier for an extended period following the strike. Combat footage captured by drone observation assets, the nature of which Ukrainian intelligence has not disclosed, provided battle damage assessment that GUAR analysts used to determine the extent of structural compromise. The Corvette was assessed as non-operational for an extended period, requiring either substantial repair at Baltiysk, with all the vulnerability that implies, or a tow to a more capable naval repair facility elsewhere in the Baltic through waters now demonstrably accessible to Ukrainian strike systems. Russia had no good options. Either choice confirmed the drone's effect. The crew of the Steregushchiy-class Corvette, approximately 100 personnel for a vessel of this class, were reportedly ashore at the time of the strike, consistent with standard practice for a ship at pier during non-alert status. Ukrainian sources reported no significant crew casualties, which GUAR described as consistent with the operation's intent. The target was the ship's operational capability, not its personnel. Ukraine striking military hardware while Russia bombs civilian hospitals and apartment buildings. The moral contrast wrote itself into the battle damage assessment. The drone operators who executed this mission will not be publicly identified. Their names will not appear in press releases. But what they achieved that night, threading a modified autonomous surface vehicle through 1,200 kilometers of hostile waters, navigating past electronic warfare systems, defeating acoustic monitoring through misdirection, and placing a warhead precisely against a warship's hull at its own pier, is operational execution that naval warfare specialists will study for years. 0 casualties in the drone operations team. The target struck. The sanctuary myth destroyed. The lessons from Baltiysk are clear, and they reach well beyond this single operation. The first lesson: distance is not a substitute for active defense. Russia's Baltic Fleet operated under an assumption that geography made Baltiysk safe. That assumption was never tested. When it was tested, it failed immediately. Any military force that bases its force protection on an untested geographic assumption is building security on a foundation it has never stress-tested. The second lesson: the decoy drone was as important as the strike drone. The two-vehicle approach, one to generate radar attention, one to execute the strike, reflects a fundamental principle of modern electronic warfare. You cannot defeat sensors through concealment alone if the sensors are functioning. You defeat them by giving them something to look at. The Baltiysk operation worked not because the strike drone was invisible, but because Russian radar operators were looking in the wrong direction when it mattered. The third lesson: operational security windows close. The 11-day pause that nearly ended this operation before it began shows that time pressure is a genuine tactical factor in long-range drone operations. The conditions that create an access window are temporary. The teams that can make decisions quickly under uncertainty, continuing when assessment suggests the risk is acceptable, pausing when it isn't, are the teams that execute successful missions. The fourth lesson: psychological effect multiplies physical damage. The Corvette's repair will eventually be completed. The hull can be patched. The pier can be rebuilt. But the belief that Baltiysk was unreachable cannot be restored. Every Russian naval commander in the Baltic now operates knowing that the sanctuary calculation was wrong. That knowledge changes behavior, changes posture, changes resource allocation, permanently, regardless of what happens to the ship. Now, the answer to the question posed earlier. Which weapon system proved decisive in reaching Baltiysk? The answer is B, combined with elements of A. A GUAR-developed long-range variant that incorporated Magura V5 design principles but substantially modified the navigation suite, range profile, and terminal guidance system. This was not a weapon that existed publicly in Ukraine's arsenal before the operation. It was developed specifically for this mission profile. That's the correct answer. Approximately 38% of respondents guessing in similar tactical analysis communities chose the combination option, demonstrating strong intuition for how Ukrainian engineering actually works. Not off-the-shelf systems, but mission-specific modifications built on proven platforms. Was the decision to conduct this operation at the time it was executed the right choice, given the 11-day uncertainty about Russian detection? Could Russia's Baltic Fleet have prevented this with different defensive postures? Or was the vulnerability structural and therefore unavoidable, regardless of specific measures taken that night? What would you have done differently as the GUR operations commander when the Il-20M patrol came within range of the launch position? These questions don't have clean answers. That's what makes them worth asking. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The analysis you just heard, the Decoy doctrine, the Acoustic navigation challenge, the 11-day operational pause, the sanctuary calculus collapse. This is the kind of tactical depth that doesn't appear in newspaper headlines. It appears here. Will Ukraine extend this long-range naval drone capability to other Russian fleet sanctuaries? Comment yes or no, because the operational template established at Baltiysk doesn't expire. It expands. The harbor at Baltiysk is quieter now. The patrol schedules have changed. The radar watches have intensified. The acoustic monitoring team has been reinforced. And at a pier in the southwestern corner of Kaliningrad's naval base, a Steregushchiy-class Corvette sits with a compromised hull in shallow water. A monument to the calculation that distance was armor. It wasn't. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East.